The Battle of the Wilderness, Lee's Trap and Grant's Gambit, the brutal wilderness showdown. In the dense, tangled forests of Virginia, where sunlight barely touched the ground and soldiers felt more like they were fighting trees than men, an epic showdown began. It was May 5, 1864. The occasion? The start of the Overland Campaign, and the first major clash between two Civil War titans, Union General Ulysses S. Grant and Confederate General Robert E. Lee. But before we dive into the smoke-choked chaos of the Battle of the Wilderness, let's rewind. To fully appreciate why this showdown was different, we need to walk through a trail of Union generals who came before Grant, each stumbling, slipping, and outright failing against the tactical brilliance of Robert E. Lee. If this was a chess game, Lee had been playing against kids who still thought the pawns went sideways. George McClellan, the Great Ditherer, 1862. Imagine you're the quarterback of a team, and your playbook is genius, your roster is stacked with talent, and all the fans are chanting your name. But instead of making bold plays, you call timeout, again and again. That was George McClellan, who had the Union's biggest army at his disposal in 1862 and marched them around like they were on a sightseeing tour of Virginia. His Peninsular Campaign was meant to take Richmond, but he moved slower than a sloth in quicksand. Every time Lincoln told him to attack, McClellan responded with, "But they outnumber us," even though they didn't. Meanwhile, Lee, who probably read Sun Tzu with his morning coffee, ran circles around him. McClellan's hesitance allowed Lee to fortify Richmond, whip the Union forces, and keep the South very much alive. The result? McClellan was sent packing, likely to spend his days sipping tea and wondering where it all went wrong. John Pope, Mr. Swagger, 1862. Next in the lineup was John Pope, who came to the Eastern Theater from the West with all the bravado of a cowboy rolling into town. Pope famously promised to look at the backs of his enemies, but he forgot that Robert E. Lee wasn't your average bad guy in a Western flick. At the Second Battle of Bull Run, Manassas, Lee teamed up with his right-hand man, Stonewall Jackson, and laid a trap so perfect it could have come with its own Looney Tunes ACME label. Pope strutted right into it. By the time he realized he was in trouble, it was too late. His army was thrashed, and he was soon exiled to the military equivalent of Siberia, Minnesota, where his job involved wrangling Sioux warriors, not rebel soldiers. His Civil War career? Kaput. Ambrose Burnside, the Sideburns, December 1862. Ambrose Burnside, the man whose spectacular facial hair was only rivaled by his spectacular military failures. This is the guy whose name is literally where we get the term sideburns. But for all his impressive grooming, his tactical prowess was, well, let's just say there's a reason his name isn't etched in military textbooks for brilliance. At the Battle of Fredericksburg, Burnside thought it was a good idea to charge headlong at a well-fortified Confederate position at Marye's Heights, a literal stone wall of death. In what became one of the most one-sided battles of the war, he sent wave after wave of Union soldiers into a Confederate meat grinder. After watching his men get cut down like wheat at harvest time, Burnside sat down and probably had a good cry. He was promptly relieved of command, leaving Lincoln wondering if he'd ever find someone who could actually beat Lee. Joseph Hooker, Fighting Joe, May 1863, Fighting Joe Hooker. If confidence were all it took to win battles, Hooker would have been crowned king of the Union. He strutted into the Battle of Chancellorsville ready to crush Lee with his swagger and a bottle of bourbon. Hooker thought he had Lee figured out, but Lee and Jackson outfoxed him in one of the most daring maneuvers of the war. They split their forces, never a great idea on paper, and attacked Hooker's flanks, leaving him dazed, confused, and probably reaching for another drink. At one point, Hooker literally got hit in the head by an artillery shell, no joke, which might explain some of his less-than-brilliant decisions. Lee walked away from Chancellorsville with one of his finest victories, and Hooker walked away with a concussion, and an expedited retirement package. George Meade, the reluctant hero, July 1863. By the time George Gordon Meade took the reins, Lincoln must have been on his last nerve. But against all odds, Meade pulled off a miracle at Gettysburg, the first time Lee was handed a major defeat. Gettysburg was the Union's golden moment, but after the battle, when Lee's army limped away battered and bruised, Meade did something that haunted the Union's hopes: he let them go. Instead of finishing off the wounded army of Northern Virginia, Meade allowed Lee to escape across the Potomac. Sure, Meade technically won the battle, but Lincoln famously remarked, "We had them within our grasp, and we let them go." So, despite his victory, Meade didn't get a parade down Pennsylvania Avenue, he got the slow clap of disappointment. With all these failures behind him, Abraham Lincoln was growing increasingly desperate. He needed a fighter, a man who wouldn't shy away from a fistfight, someone who wouldn't stop until Lee was beaten into submission. Enter Ulysses S. Grant, fresh off his stunning victories at Fort Donelson, Shiloh, and most famously, Vicksburg. Grant was different. For starters, he didn't care much about prestige or fancy dinners. He wasn't from a storied military background. He was born to a humble family in Ohio, and while he had gone to West Point, he wasn't a standout student. After an undistinguished career in the Mexican-American War and a string of business failures that left him selling firewood on street corners, he seemed destined for obscurity. His saving grace? The outbreak of the Civil War. Here, Grant found his calling, making other people's lives miserable on the battlefield. So, here we are. May 1864. Grant, recently promoted to lieutenant general, the first man to hold this rank since George Washington, no less, has one goal: engage Lee's army and beat them into submission, no matter the cost. He had President Lincoln's trust, a promotion born from Lincoln's exhaustion with other generals who couldn't match Lee. Robert E. Lee, on the other hand, was the embodiment of Southern nobility. A dashing Virginian from a prestigious family, Lee had been offered command of Union forces at the outbreak of the Civil War but turned it down to fight for his home state. By 1864, Lee was worn down. His beloved wife, Mary Custis Lee, was in poor health, and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia was stretched thin. Supplies were running low, and the South was bleeding resources. Yet Lee, known for his audacious tactics and personal bravery, still inspired loyalty. To his men, he was more than a commander, he was a symbol of the Confederate cause. The stage was set. The stakes couldn't have been higher. On May 5, 1864, the overgrown nightmare of a forest known as the Wilderness would see Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee finally clash in a truly chaotic, hellish battle. This wasn't your picturesque battlefield where commanders could gallop majestically across open fields while calling out orders. No, the Wilderness was a twisted maze of thickets, underbrush, and dry timber, ready to ignite. It was a place where you couldn't see more than a few feet in front of you, artillery was almost useless, and soldiers fired blindly into the dense woods, often unsure if they were hitting friend or foe. Grant crossed the Rapidan River with the confidence of a man who had tamed the likes of Vicksburg and Chattanooga. He had big plans, marching straight to Richmond and forcing Lee into a knockout fight. What Grant didn't expect, however, was that Lee, that ever-crafty fox, had different ideas. Lee knew he was outnumbered. Grant had more than 100,000 Union troops to Lee's 60,000 Confederates, but Lee also knew the Wilderness was his best shot. If he could keep Grant's army tangled up in the forest, he could minimize Grant's advantages in numbers and artillery. The Union generals, who's who in the Wilderness: 1 St. Corps, General John Newton starting on the Union side, you had General John Newton, leading the 1st Corps. Newton was, well, fine. Not a genius. Not a disaster. He was like that guy in your group project who gets the job done but isn't exactly wowing anyone. No one's naming a library after him. Newton didn't make any major blunders in the Wilderness, but if you're looking for a bold move that changed the course of the battle, you'll have to look elsewhere. 2nd Corps, General Winfield Scott Hancock. Now here's a star, Winfield Scott Hancock, the gallant hero of Gettysburg. Leading the 2nd Corps, Hancock was the kind of guy you wanted to follow into battle. He was brave, steady under fire, and had a knack for inspiring his men when the bullets were flying. If you picture a general charging into battle on horseback, sword raised, that's Hancock. In the Wilderness, Hancock was at the center of the action, leading fierce counterattacks to hold the Union line. His men adored him, and for good reason. He was everything you'd want in a battlefield commander. 5th Corps, General Gouverneur K. Warren. Then there's Gouverneur K. Warren, commanding the 5th Corps. Now, Warren was smart, really smart. He was the guy who saved the Union's bacon at Little Round Top during the Battle of Gettysburg by fortifying the key position just in time. But Warren's Achilles heel? Indecision. During the Wilderness, Warren found himself right in the thick of the fighting, and while he had moments of brilliance, he also hesitated at critical moments. His constant back-and-forth decision-making would later lead to his dismissal, but here, in the forest of death, he still held his ground. 6th Corps, General John Sedgwick. Next up, the beloved General John Sedgwick of the 6th Corps. Uncle John, as his men called him, was the kind of guy you trusted. He was solid, dependable, and never asked his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Tragically, Sedgwick's reputation for being in the thick of things got him killed not long after the Wilderness. During a lull in fighting at Spotsylvania, he famously told his men not to worry about enemy snipers, declaring, "They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance." Famous last words. A sniper promptly shot him dead, proving that elephants, and generals, weren't as safe as he thought. 9th Corps, General Ambrose Burnside. And then there was Ambrose Burnside, still kicking around and leading the 9th Corps. Yes, that Burnside, the guy who led the doomed charge at Fredericksburg and whose failure at Antietam still haunted him. Burnside was sort of like that friend who keeps showing up at parties, even though no one really remembers inviting him. Under Grant, however, Burnside was trying hard to redeem himself, and during the Wilderness, he didn't embarrass himself, for once. He was still Burnside, but he did what he was told, mostly. Meanwhile, on the Confederate side, Lee was pulling out all the stops with his own crew of battlefield legends. James Longstreet, Lee's warhorse first up, General James Longstreet, Lee's most trusted lieutenant. Longstreet had been a star at 2nd Manassas and Gettysburg, where his methodical, defensive style had saved Lee's hide more than once. Here in the Wilderness, Longstreet led a devastating counterattack on the second day, pushing hard against Grant's left flank. Longstreet's attack nearly collapsed the Union line and could have spelled disaster for Grant. But then, disaster struck for the Confederates. Longstreet was shot by his own men in a tragic friendly fire incident that eerily mirrored Stonewall Jackson's wounding just a year before. Longstreet survived, but his injury took him out of the battle when Lee needed him the most. Richard Ewell, the Stonewall replacement commanding the Confederate left, was General Richard Ewell, the man who'd taken over Stonewall Jackson's corps after Jackson's death. No pressure, right? Ewell had proven himself at 2nd Winchester, where he'd obliterated a Union garrison, but since then, he'd struggled to fill Jackson's shoes. During the Wilderness, Ewell's job was to keep the Union forces pinned down, and while he did his best, his performance wasn't exactly legendary. The chaos of the forest terrain made it hard for anyone to shine, but Ewell lacked the aggressiveness that had made Jackson such a terror. A.P. Hill, the rebel with a fever in the center of Lee's line, was General A.P. Hill, an aggressive and often hot-headed commander. Hill had been brilliant at Antietam when he arrived just in time to save Lee's army from disaster, but here in the Wilderness, Hill struggled. The dense terrain and confusion of battle made it nearly impossible to coordinate his forces, and while he fought fiercely, he couldn't gain much ground. To make matters worse, Hill was battling a fever during the Wilderness, fitting for a battle as feverish and disorienting as this one. As Grant's 100,000-man army, with 4,300 wagons and 835 ambulances in tow, crossed the Rapidan at various fords, everyone knew things were about to get messy. Gouverneur K. Warren's 5th Corps was the first to cross at Germanna Ford, followed by General John Sedgwick's 6th Corps, 6 miles to the east. Hancock's 2nd Corps crossed at Ely's Ford, and somewhere in the background, Grant strolled across around noon with his ever-present cigars. A reporter asked him how long he expected to get to Richmond, to which Grant famously quipped, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." Oh, the optimism. Robert E. Lee, ever the opportunist, wasn't about to let Grant stroll through Virginia unchallenged. Although outnumbered nearly 2-1, Lee knew the Wilderness would neutralize the Union's superior numbers. So, he ordered Richard Ewell's 2nd Corps to march east along the Orange Turnpike, while A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps moved down the Orange Plank Road. Their objective? Hit Grant before his forces could get organized. Longstreet's corps, unfortunately, was still 42 miles to the west and would take a bit longer to join the party. By May 5, it was all set. Ewell's men dug in east of the turnpike, and Hill's men took positions along the Orange Plank Road, separated by about 2 to 3 miles. Both armies were about to collide in a deadly woodland maze. Grant and his trusted subordinate, George Meade, were feeling good, maybe too good. Grant wanted to sidestep Lee by swinging around his right flank. But the Gray Fox saw right through this and wasn't having any of it. He sent Hill and Ewell to intercept the Union forces before they could execute their plan. The morning of May 5 dawned with eerie silence, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig. And then all hell broke loose. Ewell launched his assault, crashing into Warren's 5th Corps near Saunders Field. Chaos erupted. Soldiers found themselves shooting at shadows in the dense woods, unsure whether they were firing at friend or foe. Meanwhile, Warren's initial assault against Ewell's position faltered. His subordinate, Brigadier General Charles Griffin, grew increasingly frustrated as his brigade crossed Saunders Field without proper support. Griffin, a fiery character, charged straight to Meade's headquarters to complain in person, throwing insults at other commanders for their lack of coordination. It didn't go over well, but Grant, smoking his umpteenth cigar, calmly told Meade, let him blow off steam. While the fighting raged, there was a critical gap, about 2 to 3 miles, between Hill's position on the Orange Plank Road and Ewell's on the turnpike. This gap was where Grant hoped Burnside's 9th Corps would squeeze through, but Burnside, well, he wasn't exactly known for his speed. By the time Burnside got moving, the opportunity had passed. To make matters worse, the relentless musket fire ignited the dry underbrush, setting the forest ablaze. Wounded soldiers, unable to move, were consumed by the flames. For many, the inferno was a nightmarish end to an already hellish day. Amid the swirling chaos, General James Wadsworth, one of the wealthiest officers in the Union Army and a noted philanthropist, found himself in a dire situation. During the confusion, his horse bolted, carrying him dangerously close to Confederate lines. Wadsworth managed to regain control, but just as he was turning his horse around, a Confederate volley hit him. A bullet struck the back of his head, killing him almost instantly. The loss of Wadsworth, a beloved leader, was a heavy blow to the Union morale. On May 6, after a frustrating delay, James Longstreet, Lee's reliable old warhorse, finally arrived. Longstreet's men, including the famed Texas Brigade under Brigadier General John Gregg, marched onto the battlefield like a force of nature. When the Texans arrived, Confederate soldiers cheered wildly, and Lee himself was so overcome with emotion that he tried to lead them in a charge. Picture this, the venerable general, white beard flowing, trying to ride at the head of his troops. But the men would have none of it. "Lee to the rear! Lee to the rear!" they shouted, refusing to let him risk his life. With Lee safely in the rear, Longstreet's men attacked, pushing the Union line back and almost collapsing Grant's left flank. The Confederates were on the brink of victory. And then, tragedy struck. In a freak twist of fate, eerily reminiscent of Stonewall Jackson's death at Chancellorsville a year earlier, Longstreet was hit by friendly fire. He was struck in the neck, knocked from his horse, and nearly bled out. To make matters worse, Brigadier General Micah Jenkins was also hit in the same volley and died on the spot. Longstreet, despite receiving prompt care from Dr. Dorsey Cullen, was out of the fight. Lee's right-hand man was gone, and just like that, the Confederate momentum stalled. By the evening of May 6, both sides were exhausted. The forest fires continued to burn, and the battlefield was littered with the dead and wounded. Grant, however, was unshaken. Unlike previous Union generals who had turned back after a bloody battle with Lee, Grant was determined to keep going. "I propose to fight it out on this line," he famously said, and true to his word, he did. Though the Battle of the Wilderness ended in a bloody stalemate, Grant didn't retreat. He pressed on toward Richmond, setting the stage for a brutal campaign that would grind down Lee's army over the coming months. The Wilderness was not a decisive victory for either side, but it marked a turning point in the war. For the first time, Lee faced an opponent who wouldn't quit after a bloody day of battle. Grant's dogged determination signaled that the war had entered its final, grinding phase. And as for the soldiers, Union and Confederate alike, they would remember the Wilderness as a nightmarish battleground where nature itself conspired against them. For more captivating Civil War stories, battles, and personal accounts, don't forget to subscribe to